We got a really fun one today for you on China Talk. Will Lastry, the founder of Glass Factory, I came across in a YouTube wormhole, having watched him cut up $300 hoodies and tell me more than I ever thought I wanted to know about stitching and fabric. Will is the founder of Glass Factory. Its goal is to make manufacturing transparent. They have this really cool business model where he and his team like fly all around the world, do these like very intensive videos of factories, and help provide like a bit of a matching service to clothes makers and designers around the world as they're thinking about how to find someone to make premium apparel. He also has a large YouTube channel that we'll link to in the show notes. We're going to talk about how clothes get made, how companies pick to manufacture them in China or other countries around the world, and learn a little bit about what the process is like for a Balenciaga versus a recent design student trying to figure out how to get their first piece out onto the marketplace. Co-hosting today, longtime editor Irene Zhang. Will, welcome to China Talk.
Thank you so much for the extremely grand introduction.
So where do I want to be a designer at? I'm a designer at Bottega, and I have a new idea for a coat. What happens? What are the steps to go from that to it being sold in a store?
Okay, it's a really good question. I would first ask the counter question of, how did you get the idea? So maybe, is it something that you saw inside one of the factories that prompted you to get that idea? Or is it, a similar brand that has a product they put out that's interesting to you? Is it a mood board and then you just drew something that's a combination of a bunch of stuff? That would maybe be my first question to you.
Okay. I don't know. You tell me. What's the way this happens most of the time, and we'll go down that.
Sure. So I think most of the time the way this happens is through a mood board. So a lot of these companies, the design teams will have ongoing mood boards for their upcoming seasons that have all of these images that comprise different ideas they might have, different points of inspiration, be it other garments that are similar, whether it's trimmings, buttons, zippers, colors, fabrics, whatever it might be that really inspires them to come up with new ideas. And the team will sit down and come up with ideas based on this arrangement of images. So when things happen that way, which is the way that it happens most of the time, I actually personally believe that that is the worst way things can happen for brands. And it's the way it's been happening for a long time. But I think that's really, really counterproductive. And I'll explain why. We live in this world where people, design products and then go to the factory and say, figure it out. This is what I want to make. Now, the issue with that is that's a definition of being pure designer with no engineering, right? And in order to make great products, you need to understand both the design side and the engineer and manufacturing side. This is something Apple did very well, for example, when they developed the iPhone or a lot of their products. So when you only design the product and you're not dealing with the engineering and manufacturing, there's a few problems. Number one, sometimes the costs will be very high because there's certain elements you design that you don't realize what goes into actually making them. But more importantly, you don't realize what goes into mass producing them. It's very different making a sample of something. You can 3D print, you can do something that's a one-time easy action, versus making a full production run of something. This is something like Elon talks about all the time. His biggest issue is manufacturing for mass. So how can we make a process repeatable, especially for a more complicated product? So I think it's much better, to answer your question as this Bottega designer, if you go to the factories, see what their newest products and fabrics are and what their newest innovations are, and take all of those pieces as a mood board, go back to the drawing board, and then design accordingly. Because all of a sudden, you're designing a product that could be made much easier by your manufacturing partner. Having said that, if you are like probably 99% of brands out there, you're designing based off mood board of inspiration images of other products, and then you're going to the factory. So what do, right? Your question is, how do you develop the product from there? So It typically all begins with what's called a tech pack. So the same way you would never build a house without a blueprint of what the house would look like first, a tech pack is the blueprint for what the garment should look like. It includes all of the measurements, the fabric specifications, Pantone colors, any trimming details, where all the little elements throughout the garment are supposed to come from. A lot of brands like to use branded zippers like YKK zippers, so they'll specify which zipper they want. It's really important to do all of that with a tech pack, and the better your tech pack, the less samples you have to make, and the better quality your product will come out. Because it's like the preparation. It's like preparing for a speech. Without any preparation, it's much more likely to go poorly than well. Once you have a great tech pack and you've communicated it to the factory, they're going to begin working on a sample. A very important thing to note is that a lot of people work with factories that don't speak in their native language, right? So when you have a tech pack, you want to use visual elements as much as possible to very clearly communicate what you're trying to make. Because oftentimes it's a game of broken telephone once it gets into the factory, right? The factory owner or the sales representative that maybe speaks fluent English will understand very clearly what you want. But when they take that tech pack and they break it down and give it to the different people on the sewing line, they don't necessarily speak the language. So they might not exactly understand what you want, and errors can occur very easily. And the more times the salesperson or the factory owner or whoever it might be that you spoke to initially has to explain it, the more likely there is to be mistakes. So,
Sure.
all things to consider. From there, a first sample will get developed, and then it'll get sent back to the brand. Now, the brand's going to take a look and say, okay, this is an interesting first sample, but we'd like to change X, Y, and Z. And by the way, there's never been in the history of anything ever a first sample that is correct. There will always be a mistake with the first sample. That's always how it works, right? And the other thing to keep in mind with your coat is that a first sample is done in one size, but when a brand like Bottega decides to sell a coat, they might sell it in 6 different sizes. So they're making an initial pattern, and the pattern is the piece of brown paper from which they cut all the different panels that are going to make up your garment. So you're going to have your sleeve, your torso, your lapels, and so on for a coat, right? On a size medium, that lapel might be, 5 inches wide, whereas for a size extra large, it might be 7 inches wide and so on. So they need to take that initial pattern that they made for that size medium, and they need to do what's called grading the pattern, which is shrinking it down or scaling it up for all the different sizes that they're going to offer. So the first step, get your sample, make all your corrections, get your sample right, which will probably take 3 or 4 samples, depending the complexity of the product. And then from there, you have your right sample in one size. You then need to grade the pattern to offer the right sample in every single size. And from there, you create a line of what's called SMS, salesman samples. Those salesman samples are taken, distributed to a few different stores to see how many units they would like to order. And from there, orders are placed for the following season. The factory is informed and production begins. This is the traditional route of how things are done. It's a little bit different now for, younger brands and so on. They don't necessarily make salesman samples. They just kind of have a feeling for what the quantity and demand will be. They place an order of a few hundred units and call it a day. But for a Bottega that's done maybe a little bit more traditionally, they might pursue that route.
Gotcha. So the thing I think we want to focus on, that was really fun context. The thing I think we want to focus on for this episode is like how you pick your factories. So,
Sure.
you sort of alluded to this like weird dynamic of like people trying to like be like aesthetes and like coming up with like your ideas out of thin air and sort of then trying to find a factory to like bring their vision to reality. Look, like a giant fashion line has probably talked to every factory that there is and has a pretty good sense of like who they've worked with in the past and want to continue with. But yeah, what are the sort of dimensions on which premium brands are selecting when it comes to which factory they want to give which work to?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. It's funny because people think that the big brands have it all figured out, but they don't. I've spoken to the bigger, luxury fashion houses, and all of their production teams are struggling. There's constant issues that are very hidden, very kept behind the scenes. And I truly wish were spoken about more, because manufacturing is very, very complicated and no one wants to talk about it. They just want to show you a finished product on Instagram and call it a day. So when it comes to brands selecting factories, there's a few different ways in which it's done. So naturally, factories have their own little network. So when you go to a factory to produce a jacket, there's a few components that make up that jacket, right? And that factory can't make all of those components unless it's like a mega factory in China. So like the zippers and the buttons are made at a different factory, and the fabric is made at a different factory. That's part of the factory you're working with network. So when you go and you present them the jacket, they speak to all of those other subcontracting factories, and they propose, using elements from those factories to you, and then they deliver you a finished product. That's what you don't see that goes behind the scenes. So one way of finding factories is oftentimes speaking to your existing partners and asking them who they know to make certain things. That's a really, to me, that's the best way to find factories, because if you really believe in a factory and you hold them to a high standard, their partners are usually on that same standard. So that's one of the best ways to find factories. Another way to find factories is through trade shows. So trade shows are these places where all of these factories unite and they show off some of the products they made, and then buyers will come in from brands and say, wow, you make very nice products. Can we see more? Can we come visit your factory? And if they like what they see, that's another way it happens. And then the third way, which is much less likely, and which sucks that it's much less likely, is when brands decide to share factories with each other. Now, unfortunately, because of a clause I like to call gatekeeping, brands will never share their factories with each other, or oftentimes they won't, because it's within their best financial interest not to share their IP, which is the factories, their intellectual property. Does that answer your question, or are you looking more specifically on, based on the product you want to make, which factory should we use?
75 years ago, clothes in America, clothes were made in America for Americans. That is now no longer the case. We have a, incredibly globalized industry. And I would be curious, how you would look at, what different countries who've come online over the past, 5 or 10 years when you've been in this industry, like how they have slowly kind of what have the countries and factories done to sort of climb the ranks into the level at which, you're not just doing like piecework for stuff at Walmart, but are actually, playing with the big boys and the sort of, premium fashion houses. Like how does, and I guess, yeah, so let me re-ask that again, because we're recording,
Sure.
so we can do it. So
Sure.
So I think the really interesting question I'd love to get into is where these premium clothes get made changes over time, because it's this very classic story of leveling up in the value chain, and whereas 40 years ago the only clothes that were being made in China were like socks for Walmart. That is obviously no longer the case. And we're seeing that, of course, happen in lots of different countries around the world. So, talk about, I guess, in your experience, like what does sort of upgrading, climbing up the value chain look like from a factory perspective, and then as well from like a national perspective?
Okay, for sure. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that cost determines a lot for people. So, people are very price sensitive, and that's why China became so popular to begin with, right? If you take it back to the 60s and 70s and 80s, when China started becoming popularized, why did Nike want to go manufacture in China? Well, it's because manufacturing elsewhere was extremely challenging. There, first of all, was a very high cost associated with manufacturing in, per se, Japan. Secondly, there was a lack of, human capital and labor available to deliver on those goods. So because of that, China started becoming more and more popular. And that same trend is exactly what applies to whichever country becomes popular next for manufacturing. When China started becoming expensive, people started going to Vietnam because they realized that human capital was less expensive, and so costs were lower, but there was still that hardworking ethic that was there. So they were able to deliver the same amount of goods at a lower cost. So all of a sudden, people started shifting out of China and into Vietnam. The same thing with India, for example, right? We'll see the same trend. But every single one of these countries has their own little factors that make them a little bit more challenging. So I'd say that's why, certain countries for manufacturing become popular over time. I'd say cost is the main driver. When you're looking at luxury products, cost is still a factor. And this is what people don't understand. As long as the factory could deliver a premium product, then it's which factory could do it at the lowest cost. These luxury fashion houses have insane margins, and it's for a reason. It's because they're not just trying to make, the perfect product. They're trying to make the perfect product at the perfect price. So I would say that's what drives, brands to manufacture with certain factories and certain countries in general.
Great. So that was the sort of national level. Let's talk about like from a factory perspective. I mean, yes, overall it's easier when it's cheaper and it's you're hiring people off the farm as opposed to competing with some urban service sector job. But you still got to learn how to make the thing. And look, making fancy jeans is not rocket science, but it's also not the easiest thing in the world. So as like, let's talk, maybe why don't you pick like one country that you've seen over the course of your tenure that's been able to really start upgrading and getting the more the sort of more expensive clients, and what has gone into that from a sort of like, I don't know, what are the factors like transportation or skilled labor or like learning how to get the good machines and use them? Like, what are the micro things that you need to do to start working with more premium products?
Sure. Okay, so let's take China as an example, just because this is China talk and I feel like that's relevant. So, the most important thing in order to be able to make luxury products is you need the expertise and the machinery. Those are the two things. So as it turns out, making a luxury pair of jeans, I would not say is rocket science, but it's damn complicated. It's really, really difficult. And people don't realize this, but what goes into making a really great pair of jeans? Well, you need amazing washing and amazing dyeing. And so you need the facilities to do that, which means you need the machinery to do that, which means you need the money to do that. So
let's stay on this. Make the case. Is jeans the right one to do? Like, yeah, I mean, we do a lot of like hardcore engineering shows about like semiconductors or whatever. So like, let's dive off the deep end. With some fabric thing.
Sure. So yeah, I could talk about jeans. Like, jeans are complicated and a lot more complicated than meets the eye. So, at the base, jeans are made of cotton and they're woven. So you need, the right weaving machines to essentially weave the fabric. But now I would say in 2024, weaving machines can be found everywhere all over the world. It's pretty standardized. There's different types of weaving machines. You can get into hand-woven stuff, which they do a lot in India and Japan, but it's less common. That's very old school. It's a very slow way of doing things. In mass production, it's all done by machine. So on that front, it's become standardized. However, 30 or 40 years ago, those weaving machines were not everywhere, right? It wasn't every single country that had access to them. But as time goes on and as things changed, other countries started importing these weaving machines. And where do a lot of these weaving machines come from? They come from China. China is one of the main manufacturers of the machinery to mass produce clothing products, to mass produce jeans. So China has made it more accessible for the rest of the world to manufacture jeans to manufacture
Interesting.
clothing. Once you have the fabric that's been woven, so you took the cotton and you took the warp and the weft and you basically went like this until you have a whole roll of fabric, okay? It then needs to be dyed. Now, some people will dye the yarn before they weave the fabric, and that is a traditional way to do it with real indigo. And some people will use synthetic dyes, which could be done before or after to the actual fabric. If it's done to the fabric, that's called piece dyeing, and sometimes it's done to the entire garment after it's been sewn together, and that's called garment dyeing. So when you have this woven fabric that's been, laid out on a table, it's cut up and it's sewn into a pair of jeans. That part is fairly standardized because it's like cutting and sewing any other garment. You have your panels, you put them together, you sew them, and you call it a day. The complicated part is that we don't live in a world where people want simple products anymore. We don't live in a world where people want raw denim, just denim that's one color, that's simple, and that's it. We live in a world where the market demands some fairly complicated stuff. They want distressing on their jeans, threads hanging loose. They want certain fading and certain washing and oxidization, and they want the buttons to look like they've been used up and look vintage. But the jean was made today, but they want it to look like it was made 40 years ago because that's the market demand right now. So in order to achieve that look, it takes a lot of chemicals, a lot of machine expertise, and so on. And China, for example, has all of that machinery to do a very good job at that. That same machinery is starting to find its way all over the world as well because denim is a very popular product. So a lot of countries have imported machines in order to do and replicate what China does with denim. But it's very complicated. And when you go to Japan, for example, a lot of those machines are less available, but people really associate Japan with denim. And why is that? Because their way of manufacturing denim is done in a very traditional and old school way, which takes a lot more time and a lot more human labor. It's also much better for the environment and lasts a lot longer and is much better quality, but that's the case. So that's kind of the story for denim, if you want.
Awesome.
Is that
was awesome.
that
Let's
clear?
do another one.
I can go all day.
You pick. What's another fun fabric?
Let's see. What else can we talk about? I mean, I think, a lot of brands are making things out of knit fabric. So that's jersey, fleece, or terry. What's used to make t-shirts, hoodies, and sweatpants is very common nowadays. And it's the base for a lot of clothes that we all wear. So we could talk about that. We could talk about
Great.
t-shirts and hoodies and sweatpants.
Okay.
Sure. Okay. So jersey. So jersey is made on a knitting machine because it's a knit fabric, right? So there's two different types of fabrics typically that we compare. There's knit fabrics and there's woven fabrics. So denim is a woven fabric and jersey is a knit fabric. So it's done on a different machine, a knitting machine. A lot of knitting nowadays is done on circular knitting machines, tubular machines that will knit fabric like this. So it's these giant circles that all have needles around them, and they're knitting fabric like this all day. And it's actually very impressive to see in real time in a factory if you look up knitting machine, but it's basically just spinning and making these giant tubes of fabric. So that's how jersey is made, and actually fleece and French terry are made the exact same way. And so jersey is what your t-shirts are made out of, if you didn't know, So when you look inside your t-shirt and you see, okay, 100% cotton, cotton is just the raw material that's used, but the name of the fabric, this fabric right here, is called jersey. And that's the basis for a t-shirt. Fleece is the basis for a hoodie, and French terry is also another common basis for a hoodie, which is just fleece that hasn't been brushed. So if you look inside a lot of your hoodies, you'll see it's very fuzzy on the inside. How do they get it to be so fuzzy and soft like that? Well, they took these very big brushes and they brushed all of this terry to turn it into fleece. That's the idea. So when it comes to manufacturing t-shirts and hoodies, well, you can kind of find factories all over the world that do this. It's very common, right? What I would say is more important is where the fabric comes from. There's certain countries that are very good at achieving certain fabrics. Now, a lot of terry and fleece and jersey is made of 100% cotton. But here's the question. Where does that cotton come from? So, you know, a lot of people say that Indonesian cotton, Australian cotton, Japanese cotton, and American cotton are considered the 4 best cottons in the world. This is like in my experience what I've heard repeatedly, right? And it's very hard to get cotton that's close to that. There's also Egyptian cotton, but Egyptian cotton in and of itself is a big sham because a lot of people that call Egyptian cotton, well, it really isn't Egyptian cotton. It's grown somewhere in Egypt, but not by the river, so then that's a whole thing. But I'm not going to try to go too deep off the side on anything.
Wait, so what makes cotton good? Is it like just softer or more regular, or what's the variable?
There's a lot of factors, but agriculturally speaking, if it's grown on very fertile land, the conditions in which it's grown, the seed from which it's grown from, and then from there, once the cotton is picked, how is it treated, right? So cotton is very, very intensive to deal with. It's a living thing. How do you clean out the cotton, because there's tons of hairs and leaves and whatever and dirt in it. So how do you clean it? How do you treat it? How do you spin it into yarn? How do you spin that yarn, or how do you knit that yarn into the fabric, right? How tight is that fabric, right? What's the gauge on the machine? Is it very loosely threaded? Is it thicker yarn? Is it thinner yarn? A lot of the luxury products tend to use very thin yarns, these very microscopic yarns that are knitted together very tightly, and that makes a much finer product that's a little bit more beautiful. So, but sometimes you get brands like a Champion, for example, that like to use the thick yarns that are very heavy duty and very rough and can last a long time. And that's also nice as well for its own context. Like a university hoodie is a hoodie you want to be able to wash 1,000,000 times and not think about and put in the dryer. So that works really well for that, right? A finer yarn would not wash the same way that those thicker yarns do. And that's why you find all those 60s and 70s vintage hoodies from whatever university that are still held up very nicely and resold on vintage pages. So when you have the right fabric, you can do a lot. And that's why a lot of people will import fabrics from elsewhere, and then they will do the rest of the making in their country. So for example, Guatemala now is a place that is coming up where manufacturing is very, very affordable. It's a lot more competitive than most places. But their yarn, their quality of fabric is still not there. So oftentimes they will import fabric. Like I know a lot of people that will they will make fabric in the US. They'll make the cotton, the jersey, and the fleece in the US. They'll ship it to Guatemala. They'll do the cutting and sewing in Guatemala. They'll do the washing in Guatemala. They will send it back to the US. They will do the dyeing and the finishing in the US. And then at the end, they put made in the USA. And that is another problem that we can get into, but that is the fundamental issue with the world we live in.
Okay, so you mentioned. All right, so what is so when it comes to jersey, we have Guatemala or whatever. Oh, let's talk about cotton for one more second.
Sure.
Cotton and forced labor practices, something I'm sure you've encountered and are aware. We covered this a fair amount on China Talk in the past. Like, how has that kind of like bubbled down into your world? Like, I remember hearing there are basically like entire different production lines, and I'm curious for your answer. Like, yeah, how is all the forced labor stuff with Xinjiang and cotton ended up sort of playing out at a factory level from your perspective?
You're talking about like the Uyghur camps?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can pass on this. Sorry.
I don't really know enough about this, to be honest.
Okay.
Like I can't answer this confidently, and it's because I don't think that anyone, to be honest, can confidently speak on this unless they live in China and they can see it directly, and it's very hard to do that.
Oh no, less on the like, is there forced labor? But there's been like, Nike and Adidas and everyone, they had to come out 2 years ago and like promise the world that we're not having Xinjiang cotton in our products, right? You remember that was like a huge blow up, and Adidas went to zero.
I could speak
in China.
on this a bit, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So so sort of from a manufacturer's perspective, like when you're still making clothes in China, but you want to not source cotton from the from like most of where cotton comes from in the PRC. Like, how has that ended up playing out?
Okay, so I actually recently heard that Costco, who buys a lot of clothing from brands, has hired cotton DNA, sorry, has hired cotton DNA testers. And these are people who are able to analyze cotton and tell you exactly where it's been grown.
Hmm.
And I think that that's the future. It's a very intense level of transparency, and that's a big corporation doing it 'cause I think it's a very expensive thing to do. But that's what's happening now. The brands are no longer trusting the factories, and they're doing their own research and their own testing to figure out where the cotton is coming from. So I think that, the more brands do this, the harder it's going to be for factories or whoever to lie about where their cotton came from.
Interesting.
And it's going to make it more challenging.
Awesome. Irene, where do you want to take us?
Oh, no, yeah, of course. I had a question because you were talking a bit about the how manufacturing in Japan, because they do it by hand, is better for the environment, which made me think about how a lot of, I guess, of Western discourse surrounding what Chinese manufacturing of textiles focus on how Shane has single-handedly destroyed the planet. How do premium brands or foreign brands think about their engagement with Chinese manufacturing and trying to incorporate maybe better environmental practices into this whole process?
Yes. Okay, very good question. So the first thing I'm going to say, am I allowed to swear on this?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. The first thing I'm going to say is that any brand that says it's sustainable for 99% of them is bullshit. First thing I'm going to say. And that includes all luxury fashion houses, whatever pledges or pleas they say they make, it's complete bullshit. Because to achieve full sustainability, which is the most blanket term ever, is nearly impossible. And it's very, 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 very difficult. You would need to track all the way back to where the cotton is grown from where the product is finished and the trucks on which it's been delivered. So it's incredibly challenging to do with supply chain. So how do big brands do it? They have their claims on how they attempt to be more sustainable. But really, it's about the factory that you partner with, right? I just came back from a 5-week trip in India a few days ago. And I think a few of the factories that I visited there are few of the factories that are truly doing stuff that's much more environmentally friendly. And they're so aware of what they're doing that they will never say they're fully sustainable. They're never going to tell you what we do is 100% sustainable because they know that it's very, very, it's nearly impossible to achieve that. But what they will say is, here's our factory, here are all of our solar panel roofing that we use that's generating all the energy for the factory. Here's all the water and how we recycle it throughout the process. And then we use it in the showers that the factory workers use. And here is how, the sun is shining on the plants over here, which is simultaneously shining on the solar roofs. And we're using all these natural dyes from the plants and so on. So I think in order for a luxury brand to truly be sustainable in what they do, it's about the factory they choose because they do not have the bandwidth or the oversight to be really investing in overlooking the process. I think the fashion houses theoretically could, but they don't give a shit enough to. They just need to do it enough to have a marketing face and a marketing standpoint to look good. And, just having the right graphic design elements and banners with certain gradient colors and beautiful leaves on it can maybe get them by for now. So it's very, very challenging question. And there's very, very few brands out there that are truly, truly challenging sustainability. If I can give a shout out to a few of them, I would say I'd give a shout out to Saeed and Story MFG, who's manufacturing in India and doing it all in a community called Oroville, where they're doing it from scratch. And they're using a lot of artisans and locals to make everything. So they're coming damn close. But here's another thing I want to speak on that I think you guys are going to find very interesting. I was talking to a factory owner in India, and she's an amazing woman, very, very intelligent. She opened her factory 5 years ago. And prior to opening this factory, she was working with all of the luxury fashion houses, helping them source goods. And she was telling me how Gucci has been doing hand embroidery in India for over 30 years. But it's only in the last 4 or 5 years that they've decided to promote the fact that they're doing hand embroidery in India. And you have to ask yourself, well, why? And, what I believe the answer to that question is it's because there's a stigma around manufacturing in India, and they're putting made in Italy on their product. So it's not a good look for them. But 4 or 5 years ago, people started realizing that there's more and more artisans in India, and it could be a good point of marketing, so they started promoting it. So I think brands hold a lot of power within what they do. And I think that in order for true sustainability to start occurring, brands need to take a much larger initiative and look much more deeply into their own supply chains and be very proud of where they make things. And that's not happening right now. And the other thing is, not only do they need to be proud of where they make things, but they need to market that to consumers. Brands should be saying which factories they use to make products. That's what I believe in, and that's why I founded Glass Factory, because we're trying to make manufacturing transparent. Don't write made in China on your product. Write made in X factory.
Yeah.
That's the difference. So we know really where the product came from, and we know there's no bullshit. That is my rant, my spiel. That is how I feel about things right now in the state of the world in manufacturing, and that's why I do what I do. Go ahead.
No, I mean it's fascinating, right? Like that turning point from a consumer perspective where, like, look, in the 50s and 60s, people thought stuff made in Japan was crap. And
Yes.
now you're, the only country in the world that can sell $600 pairs of jeans are the ones that make them for, whatever crazy methodology in Japan. And, watching there be like a turning point with Gucci in India is just such a fascinating, like, psychological thing. So, I mean, I understand sort of the macro point about it's the factory, not the country. But, like, I guess over the past 10 years, like, what is it downstream of where the brands are finally, like, where the more higher end brands, where the consumers are not just selecting on price when they're in the store, are finally comfortable saying, yeah, like, proudly made in Indonesia or proudly made in Malaysia. Like, what do you think goes on in that like switch flipping there?
Yeah. Very good question. I think, I think the internet has opened up a lot of things, right? Everyone has access to a camera now. So more things are able to be filmed, which means that people from the comfort of their own home, from their chair, are able to find out about a little spot in Indonesia, as opposed to before when it just wasn't the case. And it's not to say there wasn't the internet 20 years ago and people could write about these things, but it's a little bit different once there's videos and, people are traveling there and showing that there's things going on there and so on. So I think that people are becoming more aware of other parts of the world, which makes them more marketable and more advertisable on products. And so in turn, brands can do that and actually advertise that they've made things in a certain place. I also think that people are becoming more conscious and the consumer is becoming more intelligent. So they're asking a little bit more questions when they're buying products, which is great. And so, brands have to answer a few more questions and they have to lean into a certain direction. They have to lean into making things in Indonesia and show how proud they are of making things there. So, yeah.
Irene?
Could I just follow up on your earlier point about how factories are really the ones who handle the direction of whether they want to take things in a more sustainable direction? So when, say, the factories you're talking about in India are thinking about this, do they focus mostly on their energy use, or is it the water that matters more, or is it how they recycle fabric?
Okay, very good question. I think there's a few elements they have to focus on. At the base, water consumption is a huge problem. I would say is really one of the most significant problems. Now, every factory is different. So by nature, there's certain factories that require more water consumption than others. For example, if we go back to jeans, to make a pair of jeans on average in a synthetic way requires 10 hot tubs worth of water for one pair of jeans, right? So all of a sudden, the recycling of water for a denim factory, and that's specifically in the washing and dyeing process that we're talking about here, but also for the washing of the cotton, becomes very, very, very important, right? So for that kind of product, water consumption is very important. And for other products, in a knitting factory, there's maybe less washing. So because of that, or there's less water consumption. So because of that, energy consumption becomes very important. So solar panel roofing, renewable energy and so on becomes a very important way of, looking out for the environment. Um, and the other thing to think of is dumping waste. Where does the waste go that you produce in a factory? Because factories produce tons of waste. Where do you put that? Does it go off into some river? Is it cleaned out and then disposed? What is the process of that? These are all things to consider that contribute in a large way to a more sustainable factory, so to speak.
That's
Um,
super cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
okay, so back to jeans. You mentioned, oh sorry. So staying on jeans, you mentioned like, look, people don't want boring jeans that are all the same color. They want distressed ones. They want cut up ones with like things hanging out. I'm curious because this I think gets us into talking about sort of like innovation and what directions it flows and whatever. Like, does do distressed jeans happen because someone invents a new machine that can distress them and then that like somehow ends up on the mood board? Like, what is like the, not just from a like how you're gonna cut it and how wide or narrow your lapel is, but like when you're actually talking about a like a product innovation or change, like why don't you focus on one and kind of like walk through and maybe also do a broader thing of like how the how the changes happen over time. I think you get where I'm going.
So I think, a lot of products are inspired by vintage, for example. So if you take a pair of jeans, a very used up vintage pair of jeans has certain effects to it. And distressing, threads hanging, is something that happens naturally over time. When you use something up, it starts to tear, right? So somebody decided to wear that, and people thought it was cool. That is what I think is how distressing became popular, and then whatever, certain celebrities wear it and becomes more popularized, or there's a million different ways in which that might happen. But taking it to manufacturing, it is then the factory's basically task to figure out, well, how can we recreate this effect that's been done over 30 or 40 years of wear instantly in a new product? And with distressing, for example, they found that the best solution is to use lasers, for example, that do distressing for mass production. Or sometimes it's really just doing it by hand with a Dremel that's really going through. Like I've seen that in a denim factory that I visited that was extremely high end in China. That was a very, very high end denim factory that was using all the distressing by hand. So there's a few different ways in which that might happen, but just creative human solutions, I suppose.
One more one on that. Like, are the like with the trendiness, like are the new trendy thing do the new trendy things also tend to be the most expensive to make?
Uh,
I mean, like is like a like when you see a like a new cut or a new idea coming out of a fashion house or like like a university student who spent their lifetime coming up with this thing, like it has that like creative space not been explored generally because of a sort of like a technical reason that like something has recently unlocked or it's really expensive or someone came up with like a new fabric or something? Or is it just like there are a billion ways you could possibly like, shape fabric and this is just like someone's idea?
so it really depends what the innovation is.
Mm.
Frankly, that's going to be a big factor, right? Like if it's an innovation on fabric and you have to, find a way to mass produce a very complicated fabric that's now, let's say, super environmentally friendly and has all these properties and is able to sustain over time and be washed a million times and so on, that can be very expensive. And then as that fabric becomes more popular, well, the volume of that fabric being produced increases drastically, and economies of scale make it such that that fabric becomes a lot more affordable over time. So to answer your question, in
So
the
what's an
short
example of
form,
that?
okay, I would say like for fabric, an example might be like, okay, nowadays people are very, very into vegetable leathers. They're very into leathers that, they look like leather, but they realize they don't want to wear PU, which is like the fake leather that we see on like a lot of products Zara makes or whatever. PU is polyurethane leather. It's all made of plastic. It's also very bad for the environment. So now people are resorting to new types of leathers like cactus leathers and apple leathers and grape leathers, things that you wouldn't even know leathers could be made out of, but they can. And it's very expensive in the beginning of the cycle to make these products, to make these kinds of leathers, because the processes for which they refine apple leathers by are not fit for mass production yet, right? They're starting to be now. But because of that, it's very expensive to do so. But if a lot of brands start requesting apple leathers, what's going to happen is more machinery is going to get dedicated toward making these kinds of products. Economies of scale take place, and boom, apple leather becomes a lot more affordable. Make sense?
Everything except for the apple leather part. How do you make leather from an apple? Sorry.
That I can't answer, to be honest. I'm not exactly sure how they do it. I just know that they can. It's pretty insane.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
All right, we've
Yeah.
finally
Yeah.
hit the frontier of Will's knowledge. It took me 45 minutes
Yes.
of random factory questions to get there. Irene.
Yeah, so I was really curious as to how the same factories say sometimes work on different stuff. I realized you brought up earlier that sometimes you have these clauses that prevent the same different brands from working through the same factory, but sometimes let's say when factories take orders from Gucci versus like Zara, how do they use different machines or how does that work? And also when different countries with different brands have different like measurements even, how does that work out?
Sure. So, I mean, a lot of brands will work on NDAs. And in China, it's common for a lot of brands to work on NNNs. So that's a non-disclosure, non-circumvent, I would say non-dispute agreement. You can correct me on that, but it's the three N's, which basically say that you cannot work with, it's non-compete, non-circumvent, and non-disclosure agreement. So it's basically saying that you can't work with any of my competitors, you cannot try to go around me, and you cannot share my product IP with any other factory. So that's one type of setup that some factories have, where they will not work with any of the competitors. But another setup that's a lot more common is non-disclosure, which is just that you cannot tell anyone that you are working with us. You will be our private partner. So once again, these are all sources of what I call gatekeeping, because it's them hiding the fact that they work with a certain factory, which is what they consider their IP and their competitive advantage, when in reality, I think that IP and competitive advantage should just be your capability to storytell and your capability to design, not the factory that you use. But anyway, those are like in nature how factories get prevented from working with certain brands or get prevented from marketing themselves, which is a huge problem. So a lot of great factories suck at marketing, but it's not because they're inherently bad at marketing. It's because they're prevented from marketing themselves by the brands that they work with. They have no marketing material to put forward because all the products they make cannot be advertised. So they're left in a very, very tough and challenging position. And that's why, I have an opportunity with what I do where I go to these factories and realize what they can really do, what they're really capable of. And most people are not able to find this information online. You have to be in the factory and see it for yourself. So to answer your question, no, they don't use separate machinery for certain brands. I know that sometimes if a brand has a very specific fabric that they have like an IP on and a patent on, then the factory will exclusively use that machinery to make that fabric for that brand. But that's a very specific case. Besides that, for the most part, it's really just a matter of it's a non-disclosure agreement. Don't mention that you work with us.
Sorry.
No, sorry. This is sort of super strange tangent. Well, have you heard of the glycine factory that went viral on the internet?
No, I haven't. What is that?
All right.
Sorry, we can skip
We'll,
that. But
we'll
basic,
skip it.
yes.
Well, just send it to him afterwards. So, on this sort of like NNN concept, like it's surprising to me that there isn't more consolidation, in the factory universe. Like, is that because these places are so specialized, or because brands want to work in their own thing? Like, why aren't there just like 3 manufacturers in China and like that's it?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. And I wish it could be simpler. I think a big issue that consumers have and brands have when they're looking to manufacture products is paralysis by analysis. So if you go on Alibaba and you look up hat, all of a sudden you see like 10,000 hat manufacturers and you go, which one do I choose? I don't even
Yeah.
know where to begin. What the hell do I choose? The reason there's so many hat manufacturers is because there's simply that much demand to make hats. And it would be great if, factories can consolidate more and, just be housed under one roof. But the reality is that I'm trying to see how to answer this best. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to put together my thoughts here.
Yeah, no,
So bear
it's a
with me.
hard question because like, look, like, I mean, there are a lot of things that. Is it just like because it can be broke up into such piecework that you can get started just making 1,000 really cheaply in Indonesia and sort of growing up like, but it
Like
is very striking, right? Because this seems like a commodity thing in some senses. Well, for most of the work, right?
there are elements of it that are commodities. I think that different factories offer different things. So, for example, if you're a small brand that's starting off, you have inherently a very low MOQ, a very low minimum order quantity that you're looking to fulfill because
Yeah.
you are not confident that you can sell 10,000 units of a hat, but maybe you're confident that you can sell 100 units of a hat. So because of that, you need to find a factory that's willing to partner with you and make those 100 units. Certain factories are set up to be smaller lines that will charge a little bit more per unit, but are willing to take on those smaller orders, whereas other factories are set up to be very large. The way it works inside a factory is everything is set up on a line. So when they're producing a certain product, all of the machines need to be tuned to produce said product, which takes a lot of time in terms of fixed costs. And factories are like a running clock for money. Any second a machine is not being used is a second where they're losing money. So they need to think very strategically about which orders they want to take on and which orders they want to put on a line and how they will set up their line. There's a whole art form within just how a factory is set up, and how much money that can, how to optimize a factory to maximize money. So these are all things to consider, and I think a big reason why consolidation doesn't necessarily happen.
Let's talk about a particular country that sort of over your time span has done a really impressive job of, or sorry. So my assumption is that like presumably like most factories, well, I guess there's sort of 2 paths to like, I don't know, making a lot of money running a factory, right? Either you get enormous and you make hundreds of thousands of clothes of pieces for Zara, or you make coats for Bottega. Like, are there particular countries that or what has struck out to you, about, maybe a particular country you've seen outside of China that's done a remarkable job of being able to upgrade either from like a scale perspective, from upgrade their factories either from a quality or from a scale perspective?
There's a few very, very good examples. The 2 examples I'm going to give are India and Turkey. I think those 2 in particular are very strong. Turkey is very, very strong in fabric. They're the experts of copying. So, a lot of people think China is the experts in copying. I would argue that's true for most product categories. When it comes to clothing, Turkey is very strong at mimicking textile and at innovating their own textile. Really great quality to get access to good cotton. So I think Turkey has done a very good job at making luxury product, and a lot of luxury product could be made in Turkey. In fact, a lot of products that say made in Italy on them are actually made in Turkey, shipped to Italy, label sewn on, call it a day. So that's the Turkey example. And when it comes to India, India has a new craft and a new set of artisans every 100 kilometers. There are thousands of artisans, like thousands, sorry, not thousands of artisans, thousands of types of crafts throughout the country. There's millions and millions of artisans that are all very talented at making these specific crafts, and you can't find people to do this anywhere else in the world. So they're very good at making these extremely high quality products, and the cost of labor is very low, the lowest for that quality that I think you can find anywhere in the world. So I think India is very impressive in that sense in making that quality. That's exactly why Gucci would come in and use them for hand embroidery, because you cannot get hand embroidery at that level of skill and at that cost anywhere else in the world. So, I mean, maybe Pakistan and Bangladesh could be an argument, but the region. So that's the argument I would make. And India has been particularly impressive in scaling because their access to cotton, the quality of Indian cotton is very good for the most part, and they're able to grow tons of it. So they're able to manufacture a lot of cotton goods locally. They're also very strong in silk and wool because they're on the Silk Road and they have access to a lot of wool as well. So yeah, I'd say those are two examples.
And so like the embroidery skill, is that because like your mom taught you growing up? Like where do these skills come from?
It's very, very family home. You know, what a lot of artisans do is sometimes they'll work at a factory 2 days a week, and the other 3 days a week they have their own setups at home to go and make the hand embroidery at home. So it's all very much done at home, and you know, sometimes the factory worker will represent the entire household. If she'll go into work, you know, on a couple days a week, and she'll pick up all these garments she has to do hand embroidery for, bring them back home, and everybody at home, the whole family is going to work on these goods, and they're going to learn how to do that. It's very, very, it's seriously impressive stuff. It's mind blowing. Like I was blown away in India for the past 5 weeks. Blown away. It's crazy.
You know, what is China doing to fight back, right? Like I think you mentioned earlier, like you know, being proximate to you know, the latest and greatest manufacturing equipment is probably helpful. Like already having a built-in network seems to be really important if you want to, you know, provide like one-stop solutions. Is there, you know, are there other things that China can keep doing to compete as they, or yeah, what else is China doing to compete as labor costs kind of like inevitably rise?
For sure. You know, China, it's challenging. I think that they're losing a little bit on the battle of clothing specifically to other countries, because other countries can simply do it for less. And that's purely because of the cost of human capital. So if you look at China's middle class, right, in the last 10 years, it's grown tremendously. It's risen a lot. And, you know, salaries, the average monthly salary for a factory worker in China is like close to $1,000 an hour. It's maybe a little bit less, but some factories pay $1,000. The point is, it's very, very high. In India, it's $100 a month. So you start to ask yourself, well, no matter how good our machinery is, no matter how good, you know, our access to fabric is, this, that, the next thing, no matter how good all of these other factors are, one of the most pivotal factors, which is labor, is simply 10 times more. How the hell can we compete on cost? That's the one thing. But here's what I'm going to say about China, and I literally cannot say about any other country in the world nearly as well as I could say about China by a landslide. It's communication. When China says they will deliver something by Friday, May 13th, it's delivered by Friday, May 13th. No bullshit. If you reach out to them on the weekend, they answer on the weekend. And this has been my experience 95% of the time working with China. When it comes to any other country, there are infinite amounts of problems. They say yes to every single product you propose to them. Every factory says, yes, we could do it, we could do it, we could do it. Besides the luxury ones who are a little bit more in their specialization and know what they can and can't do. and they never deliver on time, and there's major communication problems, and you have to follow up with them 100 times, and you have to run around and chase them and chase them and chase them to get your goddamn sample, but you never get your goddamn sample. It's very frustrating. That is the reason I started doing what I did, by the way. I had a clothing brand before. I tried manufacturing product, and I found all the headaches with manufacturing. I wouldn't find the right quality, or communication would suck, or there would be another problem, and I'd say there's got to be a better way, but there wasn't. There was
Yeah.
no one talking about factories. That's why I started doing it, and I started traveling the world and finding them.
And is that downstream of just like being a poor developing country? Like what do you think is driving that? Is it different for
Right.
or I guess like is it different for like countries at different levels of development, or is it more like a regional cultural thing? Like what's going on there?
I think culture is a big part of it for sure. Um, like for example, in the US, you can get pretty reliable communication. But I would say the culture is just not as hardworking as it is in China, which communicates to, they're a lot more hungry in China for your business. So they will be more on top of their shit. They're going to get to the bottom line. They will communicate faster. They will answer on weekends. Like in the US, if you reach a factory on a Saturday, they're probably not going to answer. And they might even get insulted. So it's just different cultures. And I think that communication, it's not to say that there's no other country that communication is good. And once again, the most important thing is not the country as a whole, but it is the specific factories. But when we are talking about countries as a whole, then you're talking about cultures as a whole. Cultures are really fundamentally what's going to affect the general issues I found with countries.
Okay. But like, it's the like you're a fascinating person to ask about the culture versus like development question, right? Because you have such a weird sample size. And I wonder, to what extent look, I'm sure Turkey was a basket case 40 years ago, and like it's not anymore, and people can rely on them. Or so is it like when you see particular factories and then countries more broadly kind of like grow out of that like difficult to work with, but like, look, we're just going to get you this thing the cheapest you can. So like, you're going to put up with us, and really start like professionalizing in a way that, has a lot of, ends up incurring a lot of value to them. Like what's going on in that particular process?
So like, could you ask your question a different way?
Yeah, sure. So I guess like, ultimately these when factories are starting off, like you could totally understand why they would want to say yes to everything. And they'll get overwhelmed and then they won't get you the sample and this, that, and the other thing. Like ultimately, like companies and countries all around the world understand that there are kind of best business practices. And, on the margin, are you going to work on Saturday or not is like, that is one thing, but like making sure that you're delivering on what you're promising and not kind of, playing fast and loose with people who like, if you do that once, they're not going to work with you again is sort of something that you learn if you really want to level up from a sort of size or quality perspective. So I guess when you see that, like how does that end up manifesting is like the sort of upgrading process where you go from kind of like, yeah, really not wanting to do this because, who wants to hire someone to work 24 hours a day to like answer a chat message or something to sort of internalizing that if you want to play with the best, you're going to have to reach out beyond maybe what, was acceptable business practices locally, traditionally, or, in other parts of the economy that are maybe less globalized.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's an element of peer pressure, right? There's cultural peer pressure. You have two factories. They both sell hats. One of them answers on weekends, the other one doesn't. Everything else is held constant. Which one is the consumer are you going to go with?
Sure.
Right? So once you look at it that way, well, you got to ask yourself, shit, it's going to be tough for me to survive as a factory if I can't offer all the services my competitors are offering and then some. So, in an ideal world, what would happen in that scenario is factories would look at themselves and say, well, why don't we specialize in one type of thing that no one else is? That's the best case scenario. The reality is, and the reason you have thousands of factories doing the same thing, is most factories just look at their competitors and say, okay, we have to offer exactly what they're offering now. And so you get all these factories that are just constantly one-upping each other, and it's making it very hard for them to operate and survive because there's these ever-ending, very challenging standards to live by, and consumers are becoming more and more demanding, and they're left in a position where it's like, shit, I mean, can we even keep doing this? The factories are burnt. And I think that people in general look at factories as robots, but factories are people too. If I can give one advice to people who, are looking to manufacture goods or working with factories and so on, it's, hey, your factory owner that you speak to all the time, they have a birthday and they have a family. Send them gifts. Say hello once in a while. Ask them how they are. Don't just speak about business because there's a lot more than that. And by the way, if you do that, it'll separate you from 95% of their other clients and they'll feel very special about you. With all the Chinese factories I work with, I send them, bottles of liquor on Chinese New Year, and I always say hello and I ask about their families, and it goes a really long way. And it's the same with the factories that I work with in Italy and the US and all over the world. And I can't recommend that enough. They're humans, it's so important to treat them that way.
I actually have a question about because we were talking about interacting with factories. So there's some Chinese discourse surrounding how there's a younger generation of factory owners who basically inherited them from their parents, who were kind of the first generation to get into entrepreneurship in China. And I'm really curious that since manufacturing is increasingly diversifying away from China, are people still getting into the factory business? Are people still starting new businesses? Is there still a lot of competition? Or do you think it's going to eventually shrink down a bit?
It's a really good question, and I'm not entirely sure. We're going to see what happens. I think that the younger generation is motivated a little bit differently. And I think for the most part, younger generation is a bit lazier. I'm going to sound like a boomer saying that, but I'm 25, so, I'm younger generation as well, and I see it around me. I think that in general, they're lazier, but they have a little bit more of original ideas and they brainstorm a little bit more. So I think for the ones that are inheriting factories and are innovative and have new ideas and can apply them, and it's not just about hard work, but it's about smart work, the factories are going to have a very interesting future, and they're going to start to specialize, and they're going to be a little bit different than the rest, and that'll be great for business. Exactly what I was just talking about. But I think that for other factories that, get inherited by people who aren't driven to develop these businesses, it's going to be very challenging. And yes, there are still new factories popping up. But I would say it's not at the pace that it used to be. Before, like in the 70s and the 80s, clothing factories were getting open left and right because there was a major opportunity for business. There was a huge influx of business into China, for example, right? But now with business going elsewhere, there's less incentive for new clothing factories to come into the image. However, there's incentive for new other types of factories to come into the image. Factories that manufacture products that work very nicely with artificial intelligence, well, those are probably doing pretty well right now. So we're going to need a little bit more factories doing that, and that's kind of how things go. The market dictates what factory needs are.
I didn't know you were 25. That's awesome.
Yeah.
What why aren't robots making everything?
Nice. I think we're heading towards that. But when it comes to clothing, there's something very special about a human having touched the process in manufacturing. And a lot of the stuff I wear, like, when you see how the sausage gets made, you get very particular about what you wear. So like, for example, this t-shirt is made by my friend in Japan and it's all made by hand and so on. And the print is water-based. I'm fanatic, right? Uh, that's the type of products I want to buy. And I think that a lot of people, like I said, the consumers are becoming more intelligent. So they're looking to buy a lot more products that are handmade and sustainably made and so on. And when a robot makes your clothing, the output is very predictable, you know? Whereas when a human makes your clothing, it's a little bit different every time. And there's a little bit of a differentiation to each product and a natural separation in each product, which I think people are looking for more and more. So I
Yeah.
think inevitably, yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I had a slightly different question. Like,
Sure, tell me.
yeah, like, why are there still humans in the loop for? I mean, I understand
Okay.
from like a a high end consumer
Yes.
perspective, but like,
Yes. Okay.
why are there even humans in the loop at all when it comes to making clothes? Like, what can robots not do economically nowadays that you still need people in India and China and Indonesia to produce so much of this stuff every year?
To be honest, I think you're just right though. Like robots are starting to take over all the human positions. Like if you step foot into a denim factory, for example, it used to be a human who would sew the pocket by hand, right? But now there's an automated machine where a human just puts the pocket in, it gets sewn automatically, and it comes back out. And eventually, you won't even need a human to be there to place the pocket. It's all getting removed bit by bit, things are getting replaced by robots. So to answer your question, it's happening and it's happening in real time. And robots are replacing every step of the process.
Maybe one or two more, and then I'll let you go. Do you have a sense of like what's different with like Shine versus Zara? Like when you get to that low end, like how is like a Shine process like um I know it's not your world. We can pass. Okay.
Let's pass.
Okay. Sure. Um Irene, any other questions?
I'm so curious about the demographics of people who work in clothing factories, and I realize this really differs by country. Is it still mostly women? Is it older people now?
It depends the country. So if you look at Japan, for example, they have a major problem where there's no one young who's interested in getting into manufacturing. And because of that, if you actually look in the factories, average age is 60, 70 years old, and people are dying in real time. The crafts are quite literally dying with the people. And in Japan's case in particular, they have the oldest population in the world. So Japan is very different than a lot of other countries because the factories aren't 500 people. They're 10 people and they do one thing, not 20 things. They do just dyeing or just weaving or just sewing. Whereas if you go to China, the factory does it all. And when you go to Japan, you step foot into these factories and there's 10 people there and they're all kind of dying. And maybe 30 or 40 years from now, it won't be so easy to get that pair of raw denim that you like so much. So the demographic really does vary by country. In India, there's a lot of women working in the factories, and there's a lot of women-led factories in general. In China, I mean, I've seen it all. You have younger, older, male, female, you have it all. And every country offers a different, situation. In Turkey, women are more common, I think.
Yeah. Super cool. Thank you.
Well, have you read this book, Fabric of Civilization?
I have not.
Okay, I'm gonna send it to you.
Please.
I think you'll get a real kick out of it. It's this woman, Virginia Postrel, who's a internet acquaintance of mine. And she just like talked about it was like a 350-page popular-ish book, but like going through fabric from like domesticating cotton like all the way through to the present. And yeah, it might be fun yeah, if you want to take notes or something, like I think
Yeah,
like getting you three on a call could be you might get a big kick out of it.
for sure. I'm a huge nerd if you haven't figured it out yet. So
Um, this is awesome. Will, we close every episode with a song. Is there a favorite song about clothes or cotton?
about clothes. Ah, um, I don't know. I mean, I listen to a lot of music. I actually DJ. Like I have my whole vinyl setup right here.
Beautiful.
Um, so like I listen to a lot of house music. That's like the other thing I do when I travel. I also DJ. Uh, is there a house song about clothing? I don't know.
All right, we I can come back to you on this one. Um,
Sure.
but Will, this was such a treat. Thank you so much for being a part of China Talk.
Thank you so much for having me. It's awesome. You guys asked some great questions, and I hope we can move towards a future where manufacturing is a little bit more transparent. So thank you for giving me a platform to speak about that. I appreciate
Cool.
that big time.